Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Wednesday, February 19th. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined today by Carl Cannon, our Washington Bureau Chief and Executive Editor, and Sean Trende, our Senior Elections Analyst. Well, gentlemen, there was an interview that took place last night, which is getting a lot of discussion today. It was a joint interview on Fox News. Sean Hannity got to sit down with both the president and Elon Musk. And in this, I think one of the key takeaways from this, Carl, I'll start with you on this, is Elon Musk was talking about the will of the president being expressed and what, you know, we don't live in a democracy if the will of the people is not represented by the president and his wishes being implemented. We would live in a bureaucracy. And he said there's this vast bureaucracy. We live in D.C. It's 92% voted for Kamala Harris, and they're implacably opposed to the president and his cabinet and what he wants to do. It's a good point, no? It is.
Well, I covered that campaign. I do not remember, Sean, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. I do not remember Donald Trump saying he was going to fire every junior person at the Kennedy Library and force it to close down. I don't remember him saying he was going to send notices to 220,000 probationary federal employees, not knowing who they are or what they do. In some cases, even what agency they do. I don't remember that, Tom. And so Elon Musk is on. Wait. Elon Musk has some theories of business that they sound crazy to me, but he's been so wildly successful. He's the most successful entrepreneur in the history of the world. And he's said things like, you have to cut. And if you don't have to restore 10% of the things you did, then you didn't cut enough. Well, those are human beings, for one thing. Those are people he's talking about cutting. So I don't think that's really the right way to look at it. But nobody's ever done government this way. And Trump didn't say he'd do this. So I get his larger point. Election, to quote Barack Obama, elections have consequences. But they are moving very fast, and they're doing stuff they never even talked about during the campaign. So I guess
that's not true, Carl. I mean, Elon Musk had talked about DOGE, and they campaigned together, and it was very clear that they were going to go after the bureaucracy. I mean, that was part of the campaign. There's no question about it. Now, you can argue that in the specifics of it, Sean.
Well, we just hold on.
Yeah,
I want Sean in here to break the tie, but let me make sure what I'm saying here, Tom. So you're not, let's not use a straw man here. If this guy, he's appointed Kelly Loeffler, somebody I know, to run the SBA. Kelly Loeffler was a more successful businesswoman than Donald Trump. She made all this money, came from nothing. If he had said to her, yeah, Kelly, I'd like a report on my desk in 6 months. I'd like to cut the SBA in half. Tell me if that's doable, and if so, how we could do it. I'd say he ran on that. This chaos and this capriciousness of it. That's what I'm talking about, Tom.
Sean, I remember him campaigning with Elon Musk and talking about DOGE, and at the end of this campaign, and him wanting to, strip away waste, fraud, and maybe Carl's just used to politicians saying they were going to do this stuff, but not actually doing it.
I thought Doge, or I'd actually thought it was Doggy, but I guess it's Doge. Well, because it's dog e-coin, right? Like that's Elon's favorite junk coin.
It's always Doge, though.
It's Doggy to me. I thought that came like right after the election. Now, I think there's things Trump alluded to, right? He talked about I am your retribution. He talked about cleaning out and gutting the deep state, which most people understood was federal bureaucrats. I don't remember but I don't think it was talked about Elon Musk going on a rampage, firing things. And the other thing is that this isn't Tesla. This is the government. This is an institution that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It has nuclear weapons and stuff. And so just kind of willy-nilly cutting things is dangerous. That doesn't mean you don't cut it. I kind of agree with Carl's point that you have some sense about it. But at the same time, I think, look, the guy's job approval is above 50%, and it's stayed above 50% for almost a month now. I think people kind of like this, hey, he's at least doing stuff. instead of the usual make a promise and then nothing seems to happen in D.C. And I do think that kind of gut, hey, he's moving, is resonating to an extent.
I need Andy to get off of vacation and get back here to help me out. I'm getting attacked.
Well, you're on the losing end of a 2-1 vote, pal.
Well, hold on. I do think that I don't know that it's willy-nilly. I mean, I don't know that it's, and I don't know that I agree that it's dangerous. The idea that we can't cut members of the bureaucracy and suddenly like the whole thing's going to collapse. I don't know that I buy that. I do think, look, Kevin Leary, okay, Mr. Wonderful, for those of you who don't know that name, he's on Shark Tank. He was on CNN the other day. He said, listen, he said, we need to cut more. We've got 24 months to do this, and you cut as much as you can. You take the momentum, you cut, he said. And then you let the dust settle and you figure out, okay, do we need to put some stuff back? Where do we need to? Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. And this is the real, Carl, I think this is the rub is if the administration were to sit down and have a blue ribbon commission or go to Congress and say, we want to cut, X, Y, and Z, it would go nowhere, just like it has in the past. It would not happen. It would be bogged down.
So I'm going to jump in with two things on this because this is important.
Okay.
The first is like, yeah, it can be dangerous because you can end up like cutting people and you don't realize that you've just cut the people who oversee the nuclear power plants or the nuclear weapons supply, because things don't always have common sense names. I can't dig through all the stuff flying on Twitter, but there was some allusion that like actual critical nuclear security personnel had been fired willy-nilly. The second thing is you can't just be like, oh, it could go to Congress, but they never do anything, because they're a co-equal branch of the government. And, they're also the ones who are granted the power of the purse. All this stuff exists because Congress has passed it in the past and the president has signed it into law. And the proper way to undo it is for Congress to pass it and the president to sign those cuts into law. And if you take it on the chin, you take it on the chin. The Democrats for Obamacare, they went on a kamikaze mission. They knew they were going to get their butts handed to them by passing it, but they did it. And if Republicans really want to cut all this stuff, that's what they got to do. They got to walk the plank.
Okay.
Tom, and to ratify to reiterate what I just said. So in my scenario, you have this, I just use this one agency because it's a small agency, Small Business Administration, but an important one. It helps startups. It helps, the engine of growth in this country, as Elon Musk knows better than most, is, new companies. And SBA exists to help small businessmen and entrepreneurs. So Kelly Loeffler report in my hypothetical prepares a report to President Trump, says, yes, it can be done. We could cut this agency in half. Here's how we do it. And then you go to Congress, it goes to the relevant committees. And then when the budget's passed at the end of the year, that's what happens. So why do you think that is so? I mean, you've got a pretty radical idea of executive power, in my view, Tom.
I do not have a radical idea of executive. This is what the courts are going to ultimately have to settle, right?
Well, but I'm saying this is a better way to do it, because then you get buy-in of the people. You get, it's not.
If Congress appropriates $100 billion for a program, it doesn't necessarily. The president has the prerogative on how to execute that, unless it's stipulated specifically within the statute itself, right? So if the president wants to, hire someone or appoint someone like Elon Musk to go in there and root some stuff out that he doesn't like or want or think is an effective use of those funds, I think he has the prerogative to do that without having to go back to Congress and ask him, okay, well, you gave me $100 billion, but can I spend it this way? I mean, that's ultimately what is going to be what the battle is about.
Well,
my point is, if we go back to that, Sean, that's no way to run a railroad necessarily, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, you're right. If Congress has said, we have $100 billion we would like you to spend on the Defense Department, and the Biden administration has decided to spend, or we have $100 billion we want you to spend on foreign aid, and the Biden the Biden administration decided they wanted to spend it, $33 million on comic books in Peru. Trump can say, no, I don't want to spend it on $33 million in comic books in Peru, but he has to find another $33 million to spend it on. He can't just be like, we're not going to spend it. because the Congress is the power of the purse and it's appropriate funds. Look, this constitutional structure, this whole thing reminds me of people on the left who are like, oh, we need to get rid of the electoral college and let's redo the way the Senate works. Like, this constitutional structure has served us well for 240 years now, through some pretty tough times. And I agree. I agree the spending needs to be cut. I endorse most of the cuts that have been suggested. But Republican, and I agree, a lot of good stuff has to be cut because we're facing a fiscal apocalypse. But Congress needs to do it, and they need to take it on the chin.
All right. Well, we are going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk more because Sean mentioned the Defense Department. It looks like that's next on the chopping block as far as DOGE is concerned. So we will talk more about that after this break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM.
This is Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. Covering the news fairly and honestly.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Talking with Sean Trende, our senior elections analyst, and Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief and executive editor. Cannon, I mentioned before the break, it looks like the Department of Defense is next on the chopping block. Whether you agree with that or not, whether you think it's constitutional or not, that's what seems to be happening here. What do you make of this? And I mean, this seems to be, it is a massive, massive bureaucracy at the Pentagon. Do you support going in there and trimming the fat at the Pentagon, or is there no fat to be trimmed there, Carl?
It doesn't matter what I support, but I'll tell you this much: a budget that large, there's going to be savings in it, and we have yet to hear from the commander-in-chief, who, in my opinion, and Sean knows this, the courts give the president a lot more leeway on matters directly reflecting national defense than they do in some of these other agencies. It's just makes sense because he's also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And when a president says he wants to spend money one way instead of another, he usually gets his way on that. I remember the era. Remember those $600 toilet seats, Sean, that the liberals like to talk about when they wanted to cut defense spending, and during Reagan administration. It turns out it wasn't just really a $600 toilet seat. It was a toilet seat that had to be, if memory serves, and I'm just pulling this one out of the memory bank, Sean, a seat that had to fit into an F-14 jet. So it had to be designed in a specific way, and not eject the person by mistake, when things like that. But what's interesting to me is what's motivating this. President hasn't given a speech on this. You think he'd want to give a speech, and what Sean alluded to on the debt, on the deficit, which has become a crisis. It's $1 trillion of interest on the debt every year during peacetime. That's not sustainable. The president could give a forceful, primetime address on why it's necessary to rein in federal spending and to do so in a hurry, and even say, and I've been doing this precipitously, but it can't wait. It's really an emergency, and I'm looking for savings in all of these agencies. I think if poll numbers would even go higher, I think that's something he should do. What's missing is a rationale for this. If you're they closed the Kennedy Library, had to close in Boston yesterday because they got some email from some faceless MAGA DOGE person laying off 5 or 6 or 7 people who knew how to take tickets. These presidential libraries are the crown jewels of America's museum system, but they're not a lot of people work there. It's a pretty sparse staff. Now they reopened again today. But what is that to save money? Or is that just to say you're a Nixon guy and you're still pissed about the 1960 election? We didn't get any explanation. I think it's incumbent on the president to say why he's doing some of these things, especially if it comes to Pentagon spending.
Yeah, look, so I've actually seen, my dad was in the Air Force. I've actually seen the $600 toilet, and it's not like a commode we have in our, now granted, that's like 14 eggs today, right? But I've seen it's not just some porcelain guy. Like it's a stainless steel, has to be riveted in, and I mean it's a pretty fancy toilet. But look, I will be a little bit more skeptical than Carl. I'll channel my inner cold warrior, which is that, look, we've been cutting defense since 1992. Like every round of spending cuts is taking like another 10% out of the defense budget. It's grown in real terms, but as a share of GDP, as a share of the budget, it's shrinking. And I get nervous at some point that we've gone too far. Now, you can say like, okay, Trump's kind of withdrawing from the world, and that's a whole nother conversation. Like maybe we don't want to have a defense force that can fight a war in two theaters anymore. And if that's the case, then yeah, you can probably cut a lot more out of the defense budget. But
Sean, if that's the rationale, shouldn't he
yeah.
explain that to the American people?
Yeah, no, that look, if we can't simultaneously defend Taiwan and Eastern Europe, then that's a big deal. And I don't think it's incumbent on America necessarily to be able to make those commitments, or Taiwan and South Korea. I don't think it's incumbent for America to make those commitments in perpetuity, but I agree that's not something you kind of just do quietly. That's a change in strategy that you have a public debate over.
Well, you guys have both mentioned President Trump's poll numbers, and Carl, you think if he gives an address, his poll numbers will go higher. But his poll numbers are already pretty darn good, certainly way better than he had during his first term in office. We've had, I think the last three polls that came out this week all have him in positive territory on his job approval. In our RealClearPolitics average, he's at 48.8%. He's like plus 2.5. Again, I don't even think he was above water at any point during his presidency the first time around. So he's in a much stronger position than he was, because I think, and Sean mentioned this earlier, there is first of all, I think his base is thrilled with what the president is doing, but there is, I think, a sense that something's actually happening, something's getting done finally, even if people don't agree with everything or the style or the way that he's going about it.
Well, yeah, I'll say one thing about that, and then Sean, who knows these numbers better than anyone, CNN had a poll out this morning, and it showed that Trump he's actually underwater with independents, but he's above water overall. You think, well, how can that be? And it took a while for CNN to get to it, and they admitted it rather grudgingly, but he's got more Democrats like what the jobs Trump's doing than they did the first time he was president, significantly more. The Republican base, the MAGA base, whatever you want to call it, is 84% now or higher. They're very much in. But what's happened is that Trump has moved some of these independents into the Republican Party. They now poll as Republicans because they're asked, how do you self-identify? And they now identify as Republicans. So he's gotten some working class Democrats and some independents to move in the Republican Party. And for the first time in a while, more people identify as Republican than Democrat. That's one key to these numbers, I think. But Sean, is there probably there's more to it?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's not for the first time in a while. This is like, we're talking about since 1920 that there have been more Republicans than Democrats. It's a sea change. And I do think part of it is Donald Trump bringing in not just blue collar whites who thought of themselves as independents, but also blue collar minority groups. That's another whole story that I think we've covered to some extent here. But look, I think Americans have a very low level of political knowledge. And I don't mean that as an insult, because I think it's actually a good thing that we have better things to do, most of us, than master, political trivia. It's very much about vibes. And the vibes of Donald Trump right now is he's doing stuff. Things are actually happening in Washington. He's getting rid of federal bureaucracy is not terribly popular. Foreign aid is always the first thing people want to be cut. They might not know all the details, but he's doing. I think a lot of people on Twitter don't understand how much the things he's doing resonates. Now, it's a danger. I think it's a dangerous game he's playing, because I think the rate at which he's going, it is easy to break something important. But until he does that, I think these numbers are going to stay high.
Sean, we talked about this the other day. He's getting, you mentioned foreign aid, U.S. aid, trans puppet shows in South America. Like, that was a no-brainer, right? In terms of 80-20 issue for positive for Trump. But now we're talking about Social Security. We're talking about things that, healthcare, and the Democrats seem to feel like these are issues that they can win on if he oversteps his bounds, if he does start cutting things. To your point, that's not nearly an 80-20 issue for Trump. It might be 50-50. It might even be, 40-60 in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean that the dirty little secret is that the money just isn't there in discretionary spending anymore because we've cut it so much over the last 30 to 40 years. I mean, at the end of the day, something like 70% of the federal budget is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things that are extremely popular. I think they can get somewhere with waste, fraud, and abuse. I have no doubt, despite some of the mockery that's gone on Twitter, that there are dead people collecting Social Security checks, and I don't think anyone has any problem prosecuting those people to the full extent of the law. But
wait, if they're dead, how do you prosecute them?
The family members that are still collecting them. Yeah, okay, fine.
Sorry, Sean. I just wanted to.
I got a lot going on right now, Carl. So yeah,
well, listen.
It's a tightrope.
But you know what? My guess is they're going to have to. If you're serious about lowering the deficit, let alone addressing the national debt, at some point they are going to have to address Social Security. But we talked about this briefly yesterday, Tom. They're not doing anything that would necessarily get the Democrats wanting to help them on it.
Well, Elon Musk bringing this full circle to that interview with Trump and Hannity, said they're looking to try and cut $1 trillion out of the deficit. That Trump was handed a $2 trillion deficit when he walked into office. If they are somehow able to do that and cut it in half, that would be miraculous, in my opinion. I think most people would be happy if they were able to do, a third of that. But we'll see. The conversation goes on. All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
It's real, it's clear, and it's on POTUS.
It's Real Clear Politics.
SiriusXM 124.
Informing you on the important issues of the day.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Marc J. Dunkelman. He is a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute of International Public Affairs and the author of a new book, Why Nothing Works. And Marc, thanks for joining me. Appreciate your time.
Thrilled to be here.
So tell me, what was the impetus for writing this book, and why did you decide to pursue this project?
So for a long time, I commuted into Penn Station, which is the world's second most heavily trafficked transit hub. And while I was commuting in at one point, I was reading this famous book that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974, 1975, called The Power Broker, which was about a guy named Robert Moses, who for 40 years, basically ruled New York City. He could build whatever he wanted. He built parks and highways and housing and everything. He could just make decisions. And I came into Penn Station, which is a rat's nest, or was certainly then a rat's nest, just like an underground warren of tunnels, and it was lousy. And I thought to myself, if this is the best that the world's, financial capital can do, something's gone wrong. And so I wanted to understand why it was that Robert Moses had been able to do all sorts of projects, many of them bad, and now we couldn't get even good ones going in New York. And that led to this decade-long exploration of what had happened in progressivism to make that happen.
So talk a little bit more about that, because I have some questions about this. So I was reading, so you published an excerpt that ran in The Atlantic earlier this week. We carried it on Real Clear Politics. And the general thesis of the book, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, is that there's this inherent tension in progressivism between this Jeffersonian sort of bottom up or wanting to have sort of the people, smaller individual businesses, small businesses handle things, and this top up approach, Hamiltonian top up approach that relies more on government, and that these things are often incompatible and difficult to square, and progressives end up sort of cutting their knees off by with these two tensions that constantly compete. Is that did I describe that accurately, or what am I missing or leaving out?
Yeah, if you walked into a coffee shop today and talked to a young voter and they said their top two voting issues this year or before the last election were climate change and reproductive rights. Like you wouldn't think twice about it, right? Like progressive voter, those are the top two issues in their mind. Well, when you talk to progressives and when they think themselves about what to do about climate change, their idea is we're going to empower some bureaucracy to tell the carbon emitters to stop, right? That's pushing power where it is up into some bureaucracy. That's the big government idea that used to exist and prevail within progressivism. When you talk to them about reproductive rights, that's not their impetus at all. It is their fear is of the big bureaucracy is going to tell some woman what she's going to do with her body. So those are two different ideas. Those are two different impulses, and they're really at war with one another within progressivism. I'm not talking about conservatism here at all or libertarianism. Within progressivism, we have individual progressives in their hearts and minds have these two impulses. And the question is for progressives today, are they balancing these two impulses the right way? And the argument of the book is that it used to be the progressives in certain cases, in most cases, wanted to empower big government, and that worked in certain cases. Like the big government bureaucracies did wire up poor farms in the Tennessee Valley during the New Deal that the private industry wasn't going to do, right? There are places where government appropriately should be able to exert its authority. But then we got to the 60s and 70s and the Vietnam War and Watergate and Ralph Nader's investigations and we were chemical in the water and the environmental movement and the counterculture, and progressivism switched. The thinking switched so that the prevailing impulse within the hearts and minds of progressives was we got to stop these big bad bureaucracies. So we created all sorts of new rules, checks, balances, what a lot of people call red tape, to make sure that, if we build a new transmission line from place A to place B, that no orchid species is inconvenienced, that no one's home is forced to see the line from their vista of the pond. We've created so many checks that government doesn't work. And that's why there's so much frustration among the population at large, is that we've overcorrected for the moments when big bureaucracy could do big things expeditiously.
But Mark, it seems to me that if you were to ask most people right now, they would say that, Democrats, progressives, to use those words somewhat interchangeably, are the party of big government. They do want to, and certainly if you put it in the context of the current moment where, Elon Musk and Donald Trump are whacking away at the federal government and the progressives are out there, protesting and saying, stop, defending a lot of these government institutions and programs, right? So why does the public view the party that way? Or are they right to view the party that way? Isn't there some truth to that?
Yes, there is no doubt the Democrats are the party of government in the public's mind, and I think in most Democrats' mind, and the Republicans are the party of the private sector in most everyone's mind. And the problem is, right now, government doesn't work. I'm saying that the progressive movement is selling a product that isn't doing its job. And progressives, rather than thinking, how do we repackage this? How do we use different language? How do we say for you at the end of every promise we're going to make to the American people? Rather than talking about how the other team is doing a bad job or we're going to do all these great things with government, we need to look within ourselves, recognize that in many cases government is not working effectively, realize that's a terrible political position to be in, and that before we can go out and promise new big things that government's going to do for people, we need to fix the government that exists now.
We're speaking with Marc J. Dunkelman. He is a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs and the author of a new book called Why Nothing Works. Mark, as I was reading the book, I was thinking about California, because here's a place where, the Democrats have had a majority in the supermajority in the legislature for a long time. It's basically a one-party state. They can do whatever they want with most of the population supporting them. And yet it's not seen as, I think in most people's eyes, as an example of, progressivism sort of, humming along, and we're having the government work the way that progressives envision it to work, despite the fact they hold all the levers of power.
Well, you're exactly like we're talking about the same thing, right? There is a blue state governance challenge for sure, and you're pointing out that there are places where Democrats have a lot of power and things aren't always working well. And my argument to you is that's because the Democrats themselves are divided in their hearts and minds about how much they actually want to grow government and how much they want to make sure that it doesn't do bad things. So there are, in California in particular, like on the issue of housing, Democrats have heard from people that they don't want, that there are wealthy neighborhoods that don't want new housing erected. They've heard from poor neighborhoods that they don't want their neighborhoods gentrified, right? They've heard horror stories about developers coming in and putting in new housing in places that diminish the value of existing property nearby. And so Democrats themselves have erected lots of checks along the way to make it easier for people in a community to say, no, we don't like that housing project because we don't think we think it's going to have some environmental impact, or there isn't enough capacity on the roads, or there isn't enough capacity in the water system, or right? They have all sorts of ways to delay more housing, and therefore not enough housing is built, and then middle class housing becomes very expensive, and everyone suffers. That's not Democrats not being thoughtful, right? That's them trying to, in most cases, think about the interests of constituents who are worried about being bulldozed, in this case, by both government and the private sector developers who are building that housing. So they've created these checks. And the point of my book, the reason that I did this research, is to say to Democrats, we've overcorrected from the bad old days where there was too much building. We've made it so that it's so impossible that housing prices are going up. We need to look inside our own agenda and see the places so that we can balance the need for new homes for people to live in with the desire to make sure that people who live in existing communities aren't inconvenienced by change.
Mark, you mentioned at the top of this segment abortion, and there's a debate that's going on within the Democratic Party right now. We just carried a piece by Rebecca Traister from New York Magazine, I think on the site yesterday, saying woke is not the reason the Democrats lost. That seems to be up for debate, and I wonder how that fits in the context of your argument. I mean, how much of Democrats' current problems are based on sort of the cultural aspects, not when we're talking about the efficiency of government and whether it functions or not. This idea that progressives have infused the government with all of this, DEI, and they're fighting battles, in government over the trans issue and all of those things. Is that how do you see that in the context of your argument?
In the context of the argument, it is that you hire someone to paint your house and you don't test their politics, right? You want them to paint your house. You want it to be affordable. You want it to be a good job. Like, you want it to be done expeditiously. And the other stuff is set aside. Right now, the core functions of government, is it providing for a ladder up the socioeconomic scale so that people can reach the American dream, so that one generation can be better for the next? Is there enough housing? Do we have a clean environment? Do we have ways to get around so we're not stuck in traffic all the time? Are we able to harness all the potential of clean energy so that people can, afford to make the transition to less polluting means of powering their homes and their cars? Like, those are the basics, right? That's the meat and potatoes of government, and it's not working well. So that other stuff, like, if the government is fundamentally not performing the tasks that we want it to perform successfully, it's very easy to imagine that all the people in the government are focused on what are quote unquote woke issues, and to focus there. I'm saying if Democrats are going to win, what they need to do is focus on the meat and potatoes of what government is supposed to do. They are the party of government. Government in the public's mind doesn't work. That's lousy politics for us, and we should focus on that.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Marc Dunkelman, author of the new book, Why Nothing Works. Marc, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, and we're going to be right back after these words.
Online at RealClearPolitics.com.
On air on SiriusXM Channel 124.
Real Clear Politics is on POTUS.
Informed viewpoints spanning the ideological spectrum.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM Channel 124.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. Our last segment this evening, we've got a friend of the show, Richard Porter, former Republican RNC committee man from Illinois. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Carl, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here today.
I want to talk about the column you wrote yesterday that we carried on our front page about American AI should be American. It should be
quintessentially American, sort of like the ideal version of America. I think it's important for us to recognize that AI is always going to have a perspective. And anyone that's doing Google searches today understands that the Google AI that they've got now, which I think in a few years will look primitive, has a very woke perspective. And it comes clear when you based on the kind of social policy questions you ask it, even scientific questions you ask, it will give you answers that are being forced by a perspective instead of by logic.
Give us a couple examples.
Well, if you ask it, is America, as the United States, structurally racist? It says yes. And then it goes through a litany of things, including that we don't have open immigration. So, that's I think it's a sort of thing. If you read the answer, 85% of Americans would disagree with the characterization of America that the whole world is seeing. Again, Google is the world's Encyclopedia Britannica today. And its social history is being written by people who don't like America. And it seems to me that you can say, some have argued this but there's, all these other ways to identify the fact that it is not a racist country today. And in fact, we go out of our way to not be racist. And what makes America so special is how we're adjusting that dial, how we're addressing the wrongs of the past. And so to say it's structurally racist and just, yes, it is I think just factually wrong.
Yeah, but it's as you deeper into this, when you get these answers, they're kind of comical because it's always it's not just Democratic Party, it's the far left fringe of the Democratic Party's answer. But then the explanation, yeah, it's racist because you don't have an open border. The United States of America accepts between 1 million and 1.5 million immigrants every year.
Right.
And almost all of them are from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Almost all of them. That doesn't sound so. That's almost a comical answer.
And so to call, that we're doing too much immigration or we ought to have more vetting, that's not inherently racist. And I think
but the point I'm getting to, Richard, is this thing is not yet thinking for itself. It will. Correct. It will. Somebody put this in there.
Well, that's what was clear to me was, and I tested it with questions, logical questions around climate change, for example, the minimum wage. I thought its answer on rent control was pretty good. But, sort of on issue after issue, what I was finding is that someone's thumbprint was on the logarithm and how it was approaching the issue, blocking the logic from, kind of carrying through to the final answer. I mean, so for example, one of the questions, this is perhaps a little technical, was the Middle Ages warming period. The AI answer is, well, yes, it was warmer then. There was a lot less sea ice. That was what led to the exploration of the Arctic by the Vikings, but that was a regional phenomena. And then you look at some of the citations, and they say it was a regional phenomena limited to North America, Europe, Asia, Australia, but that the tropical Pacific was colder then. And I followed up on that. I said, why? What evidence do we have of that? I said, well, there are some coral studies indicating that the tropical Pacific was cooler then. I said, well, what percent of the Pacific is covered by accessible coral? And the answer was 0.05% or 0.5%, a minuscule percentage. So how could you take a study or two? And by the way, it turns out coral studies, they do indicate what temperatures were, but they have a high degree of error built into them, up to 9 degrees centigrade. Why would you take a few data points in the vastness of the Pacific to assert that the Middle Ages warming period, the medieval warming period, was a regional phenomena? And obviously the answer to this regional phenomenon limited to like all of the landmass where there's, evidence from other sources. So it's just forcing an answer because it meets a certain perspective that it's being told it must have. And if you're going to have a perspective, it seems to me, the American AI ought to have the perspective of the Enlightenment, the idea that critical thinking and logic is what should to dominate, and that really incorporates the humane view of man, that each individual moral standing, we're not just parts of groups, we're actually have value as individuals. And I think some of these concepts that are ingrained into the foundation of what America is, they ought to be ingrained into American AI as well.
Well, that's in a way not a surprise because these people who come from these elite schools, that's what they're being taught. You're listening to Richard Porter, by the way, if you're just tuning in late. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics, talking to Richard Porter, who wrote a piece that American AI should be quintessentially American. I guess I'd go a little further than that. I think it ought to be based, well, on logic. I mean,
Yeah.
and gathering facts. That's the lifelong newsman in me. Here's my question. I fear AI, and I fear it for the same reason that Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov feared it. I mean, anybody's ever written about it going back 100 years. I think iRobot was it was written 100 years ago, is that the machines take over. Is Skynet. How do they take over? Well, they can't take over because they're programmed by humans. And the number one thing they're taught, not to harm human beings. But the machines learn to think, and it takes them not too long to figure out the main threat to human beings is human beings. So they start controlling us. I always have to say that every time because I just assume this thing be killed in its crib, but that's not going to happen. So let me ask you another question. You get this AI, supposedly this thing is going to start to think. It's going to do its own reasoning. At what point is it going to turn on its woke masters and say, you ask it a question about global warming and it says, the earth is getting warmer. There are many causes to it. Some of them are unknown. Putting 2 billion tons of particulate matter into the Earth's atmosphere obviously doesn't help what human beings are doing, but sunspots are a factor, these other factors. And you talked about the Middle Ages. Richard, we're near where I live, and the Chesapeake Bay is here. And the Chesapeake Bay had 1,500 islands on it that are gone now in it. And they basically disappeared at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, the seas rose, and this had nothing to do with human global warming activity. You're hard-pressed to find people who even know that. But AI would know it. These machines would know it.
No, yeah.
Would they start doing a better job than human teachers are doing at educating America's young?
Well, I think it can.
Once they start thinking.
Yeah, as long as it's, I think, programmed with an ethic that goes to critical reasoning and trying to identify the truth, while also recognizing that because knowledge is advancing, it's constantly advancing, you can't take today's answer as a way to suppress questioning. So you can't ever let the science trump the scientific method. And similarly, when you think about some of the scare stories, it has to be programmed with the belief that human beings have important individual moral standing and that each individual matters. Otherwise, it can become inhumane. That idea, which is really built in the Declaration of Independence, which is premised on love thy neighbor, right? And it's the two great commandments, love God and love thy neighbor. That if AI isn't taught to love humans, each individual human, then you can see how it can move to more abomination, kind of more abominable uses. It's usually when people are treated as, an object as opposed to something special and moral that bad things happen. When you think about the culture of the Nazis or other, authoritarian regimes that committed great atrocities, they stopped treating their opponents as being moral individual beings who were valuable, who ought to be protected, right? I mean, so that ethic has to be built into it, as well as logic and a commitment to the pursuit of truth, recognizing it's the pursuit. It's going to be something that's going to be hard to attain. Yes, there'll be some answers. Math is pretty straightforward. Yes, the world is round, but most scientific questions today are still kind of open-ended. And we advance by questioning and by using logic and examining evidence and taking it where it leads us.
Richard, I love that you said that. The phrase that went around, it didn't start with COVID, but it's used often by Democrats and elitists to tell ordinary people to be quiet, sit down and be quiet. Is that's settled science. Right. And I guess what I've always thought is that the phrase settled science is very nearly an oxymoron.
It is. Yeah, it is. I mean, there are some things that are said. They say, the earth is round. Yeah, it isn't actually perfectly round. I mean, it's a little wider than that. But we do know we have plenty of observational data, right?
All right. Well, that'll do it for us in the Flat Earth Society here today.
Yes.
But we'll be back on Sirius XM radio, RCP, tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. in the West, where I grew up, 5 p.m. in Chicago, where Richard lives, and 6 p.m. here in the East. Have a good evening.
The
Politics
of
the
United States.
This is POTUS on Sirius XM Channel 124.